except for you. And you are?
Dan Osborne. I'm a new professor in anthropology.
Welcome. Glad to meet you. I've had the pleasure of meeting everyone else here before. So this is the kickoff, if you want to call it that, of our attempt at a new investigator and early career grant series. It's one of the ideas that we came up with in SSP as we try to decide what it is that SSP is and what we want it to be, and the kinds of things that we thought would help the most on campus. And so the last few months we've been brainstorming about sort of how to put this together. So you guys are the first test cases, if you want to think of it that way, and hopefully you can give us a lot of good feedback as we move into this. One of the problems we usually have when we start off with anything talking about grants, particularly new investigators, is just what do you know about grants and the grant writing world, and do you really want to play the game? Is it something? Is it worth your time and beneficial and all those good things? Most of us don't get trained on how to write grants. Or don't get much practical experience in our graduate training. I was fortunate in my career that after about 10 years of sitting around doing secondary data analysis and publishing articles that I tripped into an opportunity to get involved with a grant writing team. And it's changed the last 20 years of my career in substantial ways. And I think mostly good. There are days, but it's getting the opportunity to get funding to do your own work, kind of set your own agenda, in and of itself is an attraction. And frankly, the University of Nebraska amongst them are very eager to have healthy grant portfolios. And one of the underutilized aspects of that on most campuses are in social behavioral sciences. So there's really a lot of opportunity out there. And hopefully through this we can give you some ideas whether you find it interesting, whether we can help you answer questions that you might have about grants, and those sorts of things. Today really, basically what we try to do in here in this session is to provide you with a couple of ways of looking at funding opportunities initially, and I'm mostly going to be talking about National Institutes of Health, but I have a little bit of information for National Science Foundation, and we're certainly open to working with investigators to help you identify other potential sources as you move along. And so there are other agencies and other resources. It's hard to capture all of the nuances, but the basic process is pretty much the same. But here what we're really doing is looking at mechanisms that are either specifically targeted to new investigators or represent better opportunities for early career funding. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of our new investigator development series, which is probably the least interesting in many ways, because this is just sort of background 101. And then we're going to get into much more hands-on helping later on as we move into the summer. And we'll talk about that a little bit again in today's chat. Like I mentioned, I basically want to look at and talk about National Institutes of Health and a little bit about National Science Foundation. That mostly comes from two influences. One is that I've been playing in the National Institutes of Health sandbox for the last 20 years, and so I know a lot more about it than I know about National Science Foundation. And second, there's a lot more funding, a much more diverse portfolio of funding, many more opportunities through the National Institutes of Health. Although the NSF is a very viable resource, and we'll be able to spend some time talking about it. If you look at the National Institutes of Health, one of the things is that recognizing it is actually a very broadly based set of institutes and centers. And there are 27 separate institutes and centers housed within the National Institutes of Health. And some of the ones that I think are the most common in terms of funding sources, funding resources for the social sciences are amongst the list here. The National Cancer Institute, National Institute on Aging, National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, Drug Abuse, National Institute of Mental Health, and the National Center on Minority Health and Health Disparities. You look at this list, you go, well, yeah, I don't know a thing about cancer, for example. Well, I spent about 4 years on a cancer panel, the last 2 years as chair of a cancer review panel. I know nothing about cancer. But the National Cancer Institute is very interested in getting social science researchers engaged in helping develop better intervention prevention research related to cancer. And what they discovered was there were a lot of specialists who knew what to do with cancer cells and how to do operations, but they didn't know a lot about going out in the community and convincing African American males that they really ought to be screened for prostate cancer. And that it's a preventable cancer, but yet they have one of the highest death rates in the country. And so they've put together special programs that are targeted in attracting social science researchers into doing prevention, intervention kind of research in cancer, for example. So even in agencies where you think, I'm not a cancer researcher, there are real opportunities. In fact, one of our faculty who unfortunately just left campus, Mark Kidman, got a Career Development Award, a KO1 award, the type of what we'll be talking about here in a while, for some of his work that he's doing on basic health attitude models, and he was doing it funded through the National Cancer Institute. The National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism has funded some pilot work that we've done here on this campus, for example, for developing intervention prevention work with American Indian tribes. The National Institute of Child Health and Human Development is funding, I know of a couple of 3 projects on campus. The large scale infertility grant that Julia McClellan is an investigator on here in sociology department is funded through NICHD. We have several grants funded through the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the National Institute of Mental Health on campus, both in psychology and sociology, that I'm aware of, and perhaps other places. The National Center on Minority Health and Health Disparities is an agency that at the present, I don't see much funding here, but there's a great opportunity. I've served on the review panel for this agency for the last 2 years, and they're moving into this area. There's a lot of opportunities that are looking at, particularly in terms of community-based participatory research. So I think especially in those disciplines where you're looking at being more engaged in the community, or that kind of opportunity of working collaboratively with communities, this is going to be an agency where there's going to be a lot of opportunities to pursue. But this is, again, this is just a quick look at it, and one of the things to understand with these agencies, and we'll talk a little bit later about how do we find out about funding mechanisms, and what do you look for, what kinds of things do you consider. But again, don't necessarily think, well, I'm not a mental health researcher, so I'm not going to send any grants to the National Institute of Mental Health. 2 of you in here in the SRAM program, you do a lot of research on research kinds of questions. Well, we'll be looking a little bit later today about one call for research that's out there on methodological innovations. And almost all of these agencies, and 15 more, are participating in it. They're all looking for new methodological developments in their fields, or ways of measuring things better, approaching questions better, and so on. And so, again, the specific agency is sometimes kind of something that you don't necessarily anticipate when you first went into it. I would have never thought that. I've spent the past 20 years mostly being funded through NIH and NIH, and I've never really considered myself a drug abuse researcher as much as I have had interest in mental health, but mostly in maintaining it. Sometimes more successfully than others. The way that you think about NIH funding, just as a quick background, there's 3 major funding mechanisms that are used in NIH, and the only one that we're really going to spend any time talking about today and through this series really is the grant mechanism, where essentially as an investigator you decide on the research, you design the research, you develop the research, and conduct the approach. There is a lot of funding available through federal agencies for contracts where the government has a particular survey of some type that they want done, or a particular study, a specific study they want done. They go out and they look for contractors to do it. And often those are places like the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan, or other kinds of large-scale research centers that contract to do this type of work. There are also cooperative agreements, usually again with centers and institutes, where they basically have some input in carrying out the project, but oftentimes there's a very specific, government agency criteria that's being applied here. And some of the large-scale national surveys that we use for secondary data analysis come out of these types of cooperative agreements, for example. So many of the, I'm trying to think of like the NLSY and studies like that that we've been collecting data for years, and generally large-scale cooperative agreements are very large grants in that sense, but they're not the type that we're going to talk about here in terms of your opportunities. Sometimes the initials get a little bit confusing, and so I always have a little bit of a small orientation, and there won't be a quiz later, because if there were, I'd probably fail at half the time because I get them confused. But there are 4 basic funding approaches within the NIH grant agencies, and one of them, the most common one actually, is investigator initiated. You come up with an idea, this is what I want to do, and you go out and figure out who's likely to fund it, how does it fit with what people want. Now the problem is that's a little bit challenging at times in terms of knowing does your idea have a good fit. And so oftentimes we look at other types of announcements, program announcements, requests for applications, and not commonly requests for proposals. Let me just kind of run you through those so you know a little bit of what we're talking about. Investigator-initiated research, again, it's unsolicited. The investigator initiates research, submits a grant application. So if you're doing something in the area of mental health, you're probably going to call up NIH and you're going to talk with them and say, I've got this idea. Here's what I'd like to do. Is this something that your agency might be interested in? And we'll talk, as we get into the series, we'll talk about how you might want to develop concept papers and things like this and float them with agencies. We'll just, actually federal agencies are very interested in working with you and supporting you. And the staff can't tell you that a grant's going to get funded, but they can tell you, and often we have been told, we send something to them, they look at it and go, it's kind of a neat idea, but I don't think our agency's going to fund this, or I don't think your review panel's going to like this approach, or this really would probably sell better down the street at NIAAA than it's going to sell here at NIMH. And so as long as they can, they can give you those kinds of feedback. But it's easier many times, especially when you're starting out, I think, to be looking for program announcements. And program announcements are basically where NIH solicits grant applications in a given research area that represents some kind of new or ongoing, high priority program area of emphasis. So we're looking for research in this area. Now program announcements are good because they usually have some duration, and that's important, especially for newer investigators. You should always be, if you're a new investigator, you should always be a little shy of any mechanism that comes out that has, there's going to be one round of applications, and only one round of applications, and it goes to a special review panel. We'll talk about that kind of mechanism a lot. Program announcements typically, they don't have set-aside funds. They go to standing review committees. They typically have at least a 3-year duration. So if you see a program announcement now that's just been released in the last year or so, and you know it's going to be around for a while, you have time to develop your ideas, to get an application in, maybe you have to resubmit it, those types of things, as opposed to kind of one shot. So program announcements tend to be a very good way of going in. And again, they're not really unrelated to investigator-initiated ideas. As it mentions here, is that they'll have like I mentioned before, one of the program announcements we're going to be talking about later is this broad-based methodology. But within that, there are many, many different ways and many, many different kinds of questions that people can approach. It's just that when you write it, you're going to do whatever you want to do, so that a big part of it is investigator-initiated, as long as you have these required elements within your grant. Within program announcements, occasionally you will see 2 other acronyms used, and it's a PAR and a PAS. And a PAR is just a program announcement that usually has some very, very specific referral requirements, and usually more targeted expertise, and therefore they usually will also assign a special review panel where they think that they need to bring in people particular set of expertise in an area. You don't see these very often, but there are some around. Most recent one I saw was for some call for research for what are called R24 grants in community-based participatory research. And they really have a very, very specific set of requirements for this particular RFA that you had to have the community engaged in every phase of the research project. They had to be involved in the design, they had to be involved in the implementation, they had to be involved in the analysis and delivery, the works. And so they really spelled out, if you're going to submit a grant to this mechanism, you've got to do all of these things. And so sometimes when they do that, and in this case they did put together a special review panel of people who are experts in this area, you end up with something like a PAR. I don't see them very often. PAS are program announcements with special set-aside funds. I've actually not seen a PAS. I guess I could have done around for one. But in the social sciences, I haven't seen that particular form of the program announcement. The other one that you tend to see are what we call requests for applications. This is where NIH solicits research grant applications for a one-time competition of a specific topic. And it's usually some kind of institute or center initiative with a well-identified scientific area that they want to stimulate research in a priority area. And they set aside, typically set aside a pot of funds. These are the ones that I think are the most dangerous for new investigators, because they really are, the field changes considerably. You're competing against people who are probably well established in these areas, who know that these things are coming out, and we're waiting for the next announcement to pop up. And I sat on a review panel for an RFA for methamphetamine research about 3 years ago. And again, it was one of these things where you went in what they did was they just decided there wasn't enough research specifically on methamphetamine use and methamphetamine risks and so on, and they wanted to stimulate actually a very broad-based set of research on methamphetamines. They set aside a few $1 million, put together a specialized panel. And again, these special panels are sometimes kind of odd, because I got involved in them and I had not a clue about methamphetamines, but I was brought in because I had done community-based prevention and intervention research and had some expertise in that area. But we also, sitting next to me would be some biochemist who understood that, if you inhale methamphetamines, it does certain things to certain parts of your body and so on. And it's interesting being on these review panels, because you end up reviewing a real wide range of proposals. So we were reviewing proposals where they were going to be, getting rats to smoke methamphetamine, and we were doing proposals where we were going out and doing community-based research on methamphetamine prevention. But anyway, that RFA, so when you start looking at announcements, and I brought several examples of announcements today, so we can talk a little bit about them and look through some. But when you start working with announcements, that's one of the things, that's the only reason that we just spend a couple of minutes on these things. If you see something that says RFA, that should clue you right in that, okay, this is a very targeted area, and unless you've already got a pretty good momentum built up in the area, you can make a case, they tend to be harder to get into. They also don't fund as many of the mechanisms that we're interested in for newer investigators. RFAs are much more likely to be the traditional R01 research mechanism. And then requests for proposals, you can pretty much ignore those, because those typically tend to be contract applications. They tend to be like, well, who's going to be doing the next round of data collection for the National Comorbidity Study or something like that. So they're really requests for competition for contracts. Now, getting into what you think outside of that general umbrella, then what you start looking at are what they call grant activities, and really what I wanted to spend most of the time today looking at are grant activities that are at the level that are most appropriate typically for newer investigators. And within that, typically what we talk about are the R03 small research grants, the R21 exploratory or developmental grants, and the K01 mentored research scientist development award. I will mention right away that these aren't the only ones. These aren't the only mechanisms, and there's nothing that suggests that a new investigator can't pursue, for example, an R01, which is just a basic research grant mechanism within the agency. But the odds of getting an initial grant, getting your foot in the door, is often better going via one of these other mechanisms. The small research grant, or the R03, basically supports small research projects that can be carried out in a short period of time with limited resources, often for pilot or feasibility studies, secondary analysis of existing data, development of new research methodologies or technologies. Not all of the institutes and centers accept R03 applications. And so one of the things, when you start getting into it and learning a little bit about how all of these work, is you need to spend some time thinking about various mechanisms and actually are they ones that would work for these cases. Now, we're not going to go through all of this today, but what I did here was pulled a couple of pieces of information off of the NIH site on the R03 grant mechanisms. And this is the first page, just kind of gives you a little bit of an overview, first couple of pages, a little bit of an overview of the mechanism. And then the actual, they have within these agencies, they have sort of the generic announcement. So this is a generic announcement about the NIH Small Grant Research Program. And so you could look at this and it'll tell you, if you go to, if we skip past the first 3-page summary, and you're looking at the overview information page, you can see that under the list issuing organization, National Institute of Health, and then underneath that it lists components of participating organizations, and these are actually the institutes and centers within NIH that do participate in this general kind of broad-based NIH Small Research Grant Program. So these would be the agencies, generally speaking, that would take investigator-initiated, unsolicited R03 applications. Now, other agencies will take, and in fact, there's a list, if you go back, I think it's on the second page of at the beginning, at the bottom of that second page, it talks a little bit about the institutes that take investigator-initiated ones and ones who don't take investigator-initiated R03s, but do have special program announcements where they allow the R03 mechanism to be used. And so when you start thinking about this, and again, to give you a little bit of an idea, well, what do we mean by small grant? Well, within the parlance of the National Institute of Health, an R03 grant is essentially a grant that has a 2-year funding window, and the maximum amount of funding is $50,000 a year. So it is small in that sense. Again, like with most of these grants, and later on as we get into this series and talk more about nuts and bolts of grant writing and budgeting and so on, we can talk a lot more about what you can and can't do with grant dollars. One of the nice things when you move to federally external funded grants is there aren't that many limits to let's say, limits to the legal use of money, anyway, grant dollars. So, in other words, it's, you'll get, if you go after some of the university grant dollars, like the layman grants and research council grants, you can use them, you'll be told things like, well, you can use these for paying a graduate research assistant, but you can't pay summer salary to yourself with it. If you get funded federal grants, you can buy some of your time away from your department if you want to teach less, for example. And it's a legitimate expense off of the grant. Or you can pay yourself some summer salary. Now when you do those things, they typically, just as an aside, there will be university-specific regulations, and they vary from place to place. When I was over at Iowa State, to buy out of a class, we had to give our, I think we had to pay 12.5% of our 9-month salary to buy out of the class, and that was a university policy. Here at the University of Nebraska, I'm not sure, well, actually I do know for this group, because everybody in the room is in the College of Arts and Sciences. The College of Arts and Sciences requires a 16.5% buyout. If you're curious, 20% of that money goes to the college to use however they like, and 80% comes back to the department to use to hire a replacement for the class. If you want to teach in the summer, then they use the standard summer rate, which is 1/9 of your 9-month salaries they pay. You can buy up to 3 summer months off of any grants or combinations of grants using your base salary. You can't give yourself a salary increase. You know, the university will not let you say, well, what I'd really like to do now that I've got all this grant money coming in is increase my salary by 20%. But you can, effectively, if you buy 3 summer months, then you increase it by 33%, which is not a bad thing. So that's one of the many motivations for thinking about grants. It's probably not the most important one. But the nice thing is we start looking at the $50,000 per year in R03. Really, you can use it however you can justify. Now, part of any of these grants, the R03s included, is that we're going to get into later, is that you really do have to make a lot of arguments and justifications. And people who read these grants actually pay attention to that. They actually look at your budget, and they'll see that you're spending all of your money on something that they think is frivolous and not related to the research. That they may tell the agency, well, don't give them all this money. There's also the maximum that's allowable, and then what you're actually going to get. And one of the realities of grants, you're going to write a grant, you're going to propose a budget, you're going to get it funded, and when you get it funded, when you get the notification of funding, you probably won't get $100,000 over 2 years. You might end up getting $90,000 over 2 years. 5 to 15% cuts are pretty much standard on any federal grant. And so one of the things you do is, that's one of the advantages of working with us at SSP, trying to help you think about budgets, is think about, what is this a reasonable budget? And if you go in, especially on these small grants, you have to be really careful. If you go in with just such a bare bones budget that you need every penny to pull this project off, and then you get a 10% cut, you just have to be aware of thinking about how you do that and plan accordingly. But RO3s they're shorter. We're going to not talk a lot about the body of the grant today, but most RO3 mechanisms are a 10-page grant limitation. And I'm not going to go into the structure of what an NIH grant looks like, because there's going to be plenty of opportunities to discover that later, or you can go back and look at the archive on our second lecture series last year, and I did a presentation where I kind of walked through the sort of elements of these grants. But an RO3 typically is thought of as a small grant, so we don't expect a lot of prior research. And some agencies, like the National Cancer Institute I was talking about earlier, actually put together special review panels that are just focused on new investigators and on RO3 mechanisms for people moving into a new area. So it's a very good mechanism to look at. It's a very good mechanism to explore. If you could think of as sort of getting your foot in the door. Now, one suggestion we make, for those of you who were here for our talk about the layman last semester, is another thing to think about is to even do some basic pre-pilot or baby pilot work with university monies, using the layman grants, using the research council grants, taking those and using them as a little bit of feasibility basis to establish your foothold for doing an RO3. One of the things to recognize, and I probably should have mentioned right away, is that it's hard to get a grant if you're not writing in the area. Doesn't mean that you have to be doing original research, but you have to show and demonstrate that you have some basic capability of taking research forward and getting it published. You generally need to demonstrate at least some linkage of your interest to ongoing interest in training and development to what you're proposing to do the research on. The RO3 is probably the one mechanism out there where that basis does not have to be as fully developed. A lot of people are going to look at they're going to look a lot more at potential when they're reading an RO3 than they're going to look at track record. One of the nice things about being new investigators, though, is that you get the benefit of the doubt at the beginning. So all of you are early in your careers, when you're pre-tenure especially, that it's a really opportune time to get into this, to learn how the process works. The R21 grants, they're a little different mechanism in some ways, but again, I've seen it depends somewhat on the agency. But essentially, they're grants that are designed to encourage applications for research projects that are a little bit more innovative, more novel. Maybe there's not a lot of pre-established base research. There tends to be a lot of interest in these for supporting new investigators, although established investigators do compete for these and often get them. But again, it's a smaller mechanism. It has some limits, like the RO3. I should go back to when I started to talk about the body of the RO3. You like say a 10-page body in the main part of the grant. But R21 most of the time is a 15-page body. Standard grants, like RO1s and other grants, typically are 25 pages. So the limits change as you move up in terms of how much money you're going for. But the R21s are often grants that are good ideas, but there's not good feasibility data, there's not good baseline data. Maybe you're going to be trying to access a population that, boy, this is going to be tough, and is it really going to work? Are they really going to let you come and talk with them? Or are you going to be successful at recruiting a sample that's representative of the population because it's so difficult to access or whatever? All of those kinds of things would be ways that you couch an R21 in terms of moving in, and they view these as a little riskier, a little more cutting edge, doing something that somebody hasn't done before. But they also tend to use them a lot for supporting newer investigators. It's a 2-year mechanism like the RO3, except that it's more money. It's a maximum of $275,000 over 2 years, with no 1 year being over $200,000. And we've seen several people around here, both experienced investigators and new investigators, get R21s. They're also a good early career mechanism. They could be a follow-up to an RO3, they could be a first grant, but again, because they're a little more focused, and you can find agency RFAs that are targeted in that way, then, or program announcements that are targeted in that way, they're very beneficial. And a lot of the program announcements, as you're going to see in a while, I'm going to be showing you specific ones, but they tend to, like the methodology one that I talked about earlier, and there are a few others that I'll be talking about later. Many of these program announcements come out and they'll say, we will fund RO1 projects under this, we'll fund R21 projects under this, we'll fund RO3 projects under this. So they kind of let you know which mechanisms are available. And you do usually go into the same review panel. You're going to have the same set of people reviewing you regardless. I was just trying to get off camera for a minute.
Sorry.
This, I didn't print out. There is a generic R21 mechanism, program mechanism announcement, just like there is for the RO3. I just printed out this summary page, but it does give the link here at the end of the second paragraph, so if you want to go out and read the fuller text mechanism announcement that's out there. And again, it gives, on the third page, it tells you a little bit about which institutes do accept investigator-initiated R21s. And again, that's a pretty good list, and includes many of the ones that we've talked about. And then ones that don't accept them in response to this parent R21 announcement, but do occasionally have R21 specific types of announcements. So again, it's a place where you get some idea of looking at. And by the way, when you're looking at all these acronyms, I don't begin to know what all of these stand for. I know a few of them, but I don't know what, for example, the NCCAM is. So just in case you wondered, we don't quite get that acronym crazy and memorize them all. Again, I think depending on what you're looking at, this could be a very useful early career mechanism. Now all of these are going, yada, yada, yada. Let's get to the good stuff, okay? So the prize gem here is the K01, Mentored Research Scientist Development Award. This is a really, really, really nice very nice because it's really designed to provide you support and protect your time. They usually say 3, 4, 5 years, but I think all the KO1s that I've seen have been 5-year grants, typically, for basically an intensive supervised career development experience that's going to lead to independent research. You are required, if you get funded on a KO1, to spend 75% of your time on research. The big part of your budget goes directly to the college to buy you out of teaching. You know, for example, in most departments, I know in sociology, our standard teaching load is two courses per semester. If an investigator is on a KO1, they will teach 1 course a year. That will be their maximum teaching load. I've known 3 faculty here on this campus in social sciences in the last 5 years who've got K awards. In all cases, generally speaking, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to get 75% of your time allocated to research. You're going to buy out of all but one of your courses with the grant dollars. That's how we're specifying. And you typically, I think everybody that I've worked with that I know about has been also paid 3 months of summer salary off of the grant. So basically for 5 years they've got a 33% salary increase. It's a very, very nice award. And you know, one of the things that people do is that there are a lot of opportunities to move into these. I think it's a mechanism that we probably don't utilize as much in the social sciences as we could. It's certainly a very, like I say, it's a very attractive one. So the next handout. So this is the actual generic program announcement for the KO1 awards. Now, later on, I'm going to give you a little bit of a resource where you can go and look at more of this. But you see that most of the agencies do participate in the K awards. These are very different in a lot of ways. You don't get a lot of money for research. This is a development award. So a lot of your money is going to be spent buying your time from the university. So that, you know, when you first look at these awards, they look pretty attractive dollar-wise, but I believe the last time, and I haven't read I know they've just updated a couple of things, and I'm going to point to a couple of things that I think are very important to know about these. It used to be, for example, that you could only get one of these in the first 5 years post-PhD. They no longer have that time requirement. You still have to be, it still has to be early in your career in terms of grant work. You can get an R03 or another, or like an R21. You can have a small grant and lead that into a K award, and I've seen at least one investigator do that. But you can also move right into K awards, and we've worked with people who've done that as well. And the K award elements, though, is that you get up to $50,000 a year for each of the years for your research activities. But that's kind of very broadly based, so that some of it may actually be data collection, some of it may be other kinds of training things you're doing. Oftentimes, well, let me step back half step. One of the things that's critical to the K award is you have to get a mentor. You have to have a plan, and the plan has to be good. And your mentor has to be on board. You can't just write an email to somebody and say, hey, you know, if I write a grant, get funded, you're going to be my mentor. Because they're going to have to write a statement, they're going to have to put some stuff into your packet. And I've said on a K award review committee at NIDA, and I've listened to review members, panel members say, you know, this is a really good idea, this is a bright young investigator, but I don't think the mentor has any idea what they're doing. So you read this mentor's letter and it just doesn't correspond with what the person's talking about. So I think one of the things that you really have to think about, and this, you know, is in the area that you want to work, is developing a mentor relationship. You're going to have to find somebody who's an expert in your area, or find people who are experts in your area, and get linked with them. And oftentimes what you're going to need to do is you need to look at where your skills are, what do you want to do to develop this plan. And you are going to have a research plan. Now I'll use the example of Kim Tyler in our department has just finished, as of I think about last month, her 5-year K award. She did it on, she wanted to do research on homes and runaway adolescents and mental health aspects of that. Now, what she did was, we had a NIMH funded researcher, Les Whitbeck,
who had worked with her at her dissertation level, so he knew a little bit about her work, who was one of her sponsors. And so she had this established social scientist who'd been doing funded grant work on homeless and rural youth. But then she wanted to bring some new twist to it. It probably wouldn't have gotten her grant funded if she'd just gone in and saying, well, you know, I've been a research assistant with Les Whitbeck for 2 years, and now I want to go out and become an independent homeless researcher. What she did was she said, but you know, what I really want to do is I want to develop it into this new area. I want to look at risk behaviors. And one of the things that we really need to understand about risk behaviors is stuff about the social networks of these kids. So she built in working with one of the leading social networks people. Got, you know, K wards take a lot of phone work. They take a lot of time. Sometimes some FaceTime with people, getting to meet people, traveling to talk to people. Some of which, depending if you come into the program we're talking about, you can get support for. But the idea would be, like, for example, she set up a connection with Susan Ennett at North Carolina University, who's one of the experts in social networking, and essentially networked with Dr. Ennett to become one of the mentors on her project. And then set up, as part of her training, I believe, and I could be a little bit wrong about this, I get grants muddled sometimes, amongst other things, but that she, you know, plan for going over there and doing some work with her, sharing instruments, giving her feedback. Usually what you're going to do with mentors is you're going to budget trips to go work with them for a while, to meet with them, maybe occasionally to have them come into where your home university is. So they don't have to be at your home base. Sometimes it's a good, if there is a local mentor, to have that combination of a local mentor and a more distant one. But I've seen successful RL1 or KO1 awards where neither of the mentors have been local. Now she also wanted to do some research. She wanted to be able to demonstrate one of the big problems with homeless research is about feasibility of sampling. And so she went out and through some connections that Les and I had, we were able to get her hooked up with James Wright, who at the time was down at Tulane University. He's now down in Florida. But she started working with Jim too. And so she basically had 3 mentors in her award, Les, the local homeless person, but then she went to another university, so he became the distant homeless person. But you know, the point is that she had somebody who was sort of a social scientist with expertise in surveying homeless populations. She had another social scientist who was an expert in social networking, which was one of the new pieces that she wanted to fold in. And then a sampling expert had done a lot of work with the U.S. Census on sampling homeless populations to design new strategies for reaching out and finding the particular population she wanted to find. So a K award is very complicated in the sense that you have to pose some good science, and you have to be able to identify all of the elements of the good science. But you don't have to be ready to do all of it. What you have to do is you have to say, here's what I've got, here's where I've been, and here are the 3 things that I really need to develop over the next 5 years so that I'll be able to write an RL1 grant application when I'm done. And actually that's the expectation. When you finish a K award, the expectation from the agency is that within a year you're going to be submitting an RL1 grant. They are really committed. This is a program that's committed to the training and development of young faculty into the next generation of grant-funded researchers. One of the things that I should mention about all of this too is there's a lot of things you have to think about with grants, and the K awards are probably a really good example of that. You have to be patient. You have to balance it with everything else that you're doing, because you guys are pre-tenured, and you know, if you spend 3 years working up a grant and you get it funded, but your P&T committee is reviewing your file and saying, well, you know, for the last 3 years, all you've done is work on this grant. You haven't published any articles. And even if the grant gets funded, that might not be enough to take you forward to tenure. So one of the challenges is always looking at that mix of what you're doing. And one of the things that we'll do is people come to us and talk about, well, is this the right time for me to get involved in this grant development series, and do I want to get more fully engaged in the summer workshop? One of the things we'll be doing is sitting down with them and saying, well, let's look at your vita, let's talk about where you're at in your program? And are you at the place that you want to be writing a grant right now? Or maybe, is this the time that you should take the next year to get 2 or 3 articles out under review in this general area, and then come back and start working on the grant? You know, I can tell you, for example, that with Kim, when she first went in with her first round of the K Award, she had 3, maybe 4 publications, most of them co-authored, but 3 or 4 publications that were in the general area that she was going to be a K Award in. So it was clearly an early career trajectory that was showing her interest in this topic area. I can also tell you that even though I think she wrote a really good proposal the first time, she had to submit it 3 times. And the review process for grants is a slow one. So you submit a grant, and then you wait 6 months or longer. It kind of depends. I mean, basically, there are specified time periods during the year, 3 time periods during the year when the grants are submitted. And usually what will happen is that from the time that you submit a grant and then you get feedback after the next review period, so you get feedback about 5 months later, which you really can turn it around fast to do a revision and resubmit. At best, you're going to resubmit 8 months after your first submission. And so if you have to, like Kim did, if you have to resubmit 2 times, you end up looking at taking 2.5 years to get the grant funded. So it is a process that you need to understand that there's a lot of patience involved, and it is, as I'll be showing you a bit later, the success rates. You got to understand it's a little bit different than submitting an article to a journal. This is a very competitive game. And you're going to be competing against a lot of other very bright people, and so it's writing a good grant is not always good enough. Those of us who've been engaged in grant writing over the years can tell you that we've had some very nice grants that never got funded. We just couldn't convince a particular review committee, or we couldn't get. I mean, we could convince a committee, but what you have to understand is that you get rated on most of these agencies in terms of percentiles. And most of the agencies we're looking at, a grant to get funded is going to have to be to be sure of being funded, it has to be in the top 10% of the ranked grants. If you're at 15th percentile, you may not get funded. That's you're seeing here amongst a pile of very good applications, you have to be at the very top of it. And so it is very competitive, and I think that's one of the things that we try to help people look at. Are you really ready for this? What all is going to be involved in it? But the K Award is a very attractive award. There are some other early career mechanisms out there. I'm going to skip over the NSF thing for a minute. I'll come back to it. I want to skip to this new Investigator program site. You definitely should go and look at this, whether you're looking at this is an NIH site, but it gives you a lot of good pointers. It talks a lot about, especially if you're interested, and I know a lot of you are in the K Award mechanism, it's going to tell you about nuances of the K Award that are different from agency to agency. So for example, the National Institute of Drug Abuse has a special K review committee. They actually take a special committee, and I've had the good fortune, and Rick Bevins over in psychology, so both of us have probably be good resources. We've both sat on that committee and reviewed grants, and it's just a whole different experience because the entire mechanism of the award committee it's not just KO1s. There are other career development grants. There are the F31s, F32s. Those are the pre-doctoral research fellowships, the postdoctoral research fellowships. The K series, actually they have what they call a K kiosk out there on NIH that talks about all the K mechanisms. There's a KO2, which is for kind of mid-career people. There's a KO5, which is support senior faculty. So there's several different mechanisms out there. But this committee would only review these kinds of training, development, career development types of grants. And so we came into it with a very targeted kind of viewpoint of understanding how people that we're looking at are all in this kind of similar career stage. Now, Kim Tyler was talking about earlier, her grant, and I think the reason that she ended up having to submit 3 times, and by the way, 3 times is the maximum. You don't get funded the 3rd time, you cannot resubmit the grant. And you can't slap a new label on it and send it back in. No, it would go back to the same committee, they'd reject it as violating the rules. In fact, it has to be substantially different. The specific aims and the focus of it aren't different enough that they won't let you resubmit it even if you tweak it here and there. But Kim's went to a standing committee. And that meant that, because she was going to the National Institute of Mental Health, and the National Institute of Mental Health K awards are not set aside for a special committee. They're going to be right in there with R21s and R01s and other kinds of grants that are fit within a particular area. So they tend to group them. So she'd be in with other social science grants, but they'd be all different types. And frankly, some of the things that she got back when we looked at her critiques, we thought, you know, this person kind of lost track of the fact that this was a K award because she doesn't have enough money to do all the things you're telling her to do. And so then you have to write responses, and the whole revise and resubmit process and grants is something that we would build into the series also. Is a very, very complicated, very different than what you would expect under most mechanisms. But this site is a very good site to look into. There's also a new mechanism out there that I don't know much about yet because they just started it last year. But from what little I know about it, and I've heard a little bit about it, I don't think it applies to you all. Because it's a career transition award, but it really looks like it's trying to take people who are just finishing their PhDs, who have not yet landed a tenure track job. And it's kind of it's a very sweet looking award too. In fact, I'm going to talk to one of our people about it now, and I looked at it a little bit more getting ready for this talk. Because it's kind of designed to be, the first 2 years are kind of designed to be a postdoc. And then the next 3 years are supposed to be sort of a mini KO1 for the first 3 years of the faculty appointment. So the goal of the first 2 years is to really develop your research to a place where you can get a tenure track faculty position, and then the next 3 years will help you get off the fast track there. So it's a very interesting mechanism. It's described there. There is also something called the B-Start mechanism. Now, the B-Start is even smaller than the RO3s. It's a very quick, rapid turnaround review mechanism. It has some disadvantages in the fact that it's, okay, judgment call. I have to admit a judgment call. I know somebody who wrote a very good B-Start application, had a very good score. They don't put a lot of money into it in certain agencies, and so even if they participate, the funding's pretty minimum, and so I don't often encourage on B-Start. You don't resubmit; it's a one-time submission, and so it's a little bit higher risk and lower return. But anyway, if you go out there and you look at it, and they also have a lot of fun little charts and things that'll show you funding, funding breakouts over the years in the various agencies and how many of the grants funded were for new investigators and stuff like that. So there are some useful, and also they point to some other sites for going out and finding out about things that are out there. They also do mention there are some new initiatives that I don't know a lot about yet, but we will talk about a little bit at a later point, where they are starting to try to accelerate the turnaround time for new investigators. And those are also very useful. This is the, so like for example, I've heard on the RO3s that they're starting to try to do accelerated reviews, so you get your reviews back in 3 or 4 months instead of 6 to 8 months, and some things like that. But this is the NSF. I'm going to go back now. I kind of skipped over this, and again, I don't know a lot about this program. And right now, and part of the reason I'm spending a lot of time on it is that when you go to their site, they're saying, well, we haven't put out the new program announcement yet, and there's some slight changes, and it's coming out soon. But I want to at least get it in front of you. This is specifically targeted to folks like you. This is targeted to people who have got a tenure track job but do not yet have tenure. So it's an early career award. You go to the site, you can look at the kinds of things that have been funded. There are some social science types of projects that have been funded, and there's one that I'm going to be spending a little more time as we start moving towards some and learning about, because it may be that for some of you, as we start looking at this, that this could be a better opportunity than the K-01. I think that probably a big question and the trade-off would essentially be the type of subject matter that you're particularly interested in. NSF is going to be a little bit broader. It's, you're going to have a little more flexibility in terms of that. NIH agencies obviously all have agendas. If you're going to get funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, then ultimately your dependent variable has to be related to mental health. With the National Science Foundation, clearly, what you're trying to do is to make scientific advancement in their field very broadly defined, and the fields. By the way, when you see this, oftentimes you recognize there is this distinction within the National Science Foundation. Sometimes people thinking of it as basically just the physical sciences, the hard sciences, but there is the director of social, behavioral, and economic sciences. When you read announcements from the National Science Foundation that talk about, anytime that they use the word science as part of the announcement, that is inclusive of the social sciences. So there are opportunities there. They're going to be specific, so what you would really need to do is to look up the opportunities within your own disciplinary areas and see exactly what they are. And like I say, there's supposed to be a new announcement coming out about the Early Career Development Award. It is really very much, though, designated to work with early pre-tenure assistant professors. And there are goals in here that talk about how you're going to be integrating your research with your teaching, with the educational position. And so it would be a slightly different kind of grant in that way, and the kinds of issues that you're going to need to address in pursuing that type of grant would be different in that respect. I wanted to throw up a couple of charts. These are slightly dated, but I didn't have time to go out and find the new ones before the meeting, but I think it'll give you an idea. These are some kinds of, the funding rates. And one of the things you should understand with various agencies is that they do have different amounts of money and they have different success rates. And so, for example, if you're looking here, you see that the National Institute of Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse had a much higher success rate in the year 2005 for grants getting funded at 30%. Now, this is grants overall, these aren't specifically new investigator grants. And compared to NICHD, which had more money but had a lower success rate, about 17%. And again, these success rates are a little bit deceptive. For example, you look at NIMH, it says 21%. But one of the challenges you have with talking about grants is that some grants, and some grants projects are fairly big ticket, so there's a lot of money involved in supporting them. And so that when you're actually looking at success rates here, it's a little harder to tell in terms of that type of balance. But the success rates here are in terms of the number of grants submitted, the number of grants rewarded, not in terms of the dollar basis. But what I'm trying to get around saying is that I've never seen an NIMH where a review panel would fund 21%, down to the 21st percentile in ranked grants. So somehow in the mix of things, it doesn't quite work out to be that way. When you see the success rates, and when you go into a particular review panel, I know 2 grants right now that have been floating around this campus. I think both of them are probably going to end up getting good news, but both of them were right at 14th to 15th percentile, and have had to wait months to find out whether or not they were going to get funded. So again, it's a very competitive process. It's important to understand that going in. You've got to pay a lot of attention to quality of work. And even just, when you're writing grants, even small little mistakes is all it's going to take is to move you from being ranked as a fundable grant and going into the non-fundable area. Because you're competing, again, kind of the pool you're competing against. If we look at grant mechanisms, this is particularly for new grant funding in 2005. You do see that the RO3s have a higher success rate. And again, if you look at specific agencies, you'll see that within agencies, there's even some more variation there. So there are subtle distinctions that you can look at in this context. What I wanted to do is I brought along a lot of other material. One of the things to do to find out about grants and grant mechanisms is to go online and see, what am I handing out? This is what I want to hand out. I knew there was something I want to hand out. This is, and actually this isn't the full program announcement. I've got, just before we start talking about the one I handed out, I'll give you an idea here. I've got, and I'll just pass these around if you want to glance at it, but I just went out and called up a few. And I just have one copy of each of these. I didn't think I wanted to print out 30-page handouts of things that you might have no interest in. But you know, for example, this is a program announcement, a PA, on NIH exploratory developmental research grant programs. This is the R21 parent grant, so it's like the R03 parent grant that we looked at earlier. This is an R03 announcement. It is I'm looking for my magic letters. It's a PA, it's a program announcement. This is one and this is the full text of this. So this is a specific program announcement, and this one is about a year ago. Yeah, September of 2007, a little more than a year ago. They came out with a series of program announcements on research on ethical issues and human subjects research. And actually there are 3 announcements out. There's an R03, there's an R21, and there's an R01 announcement. So this is an example of that one. Now this is, you know, I mentioned before, there's program announcements. This particular one is to give you an idea, this is an RFA. So this is an example of one that, this was an RFA for the National Center on Minority Health and Health Disparities. That was for what they call an R24 grant, which is basically initiating research on health disparities. Now, because it's an RFA, this is a one cycle grant. Actually, I served on this grant review committee. We just finished reviewing the grants last December. This is the second round. About 2 years ago, we did the first round, and I was one of the reviewers then as well. And that's the odd thing about these. It's not a standing panel. You're not reviewing grants every 4 months. With these RFAs, and again, so that's the kind of thing you look for. You see, well, this is an RFA, then it's going to be something that's going to be a one-shot opportunity. And there are other things out there that are related, but this particular opportunity is gone now. We funded a certain number of grants on it, and now they're going to have another opportunity in about 3 years. The final one here is a program announcement. And actually it's the one that I passed out. This is the fuller text on it. So this is an example of, and since I knew that there were going to be a couple of people here with methodological interests, I thought I'd at least pick an example that might strike home to someone. And I thought it would be good to give you one to look at a little bit. And I actually cut off, I didn't put in all of the details, and there's the back part of this, that here's the full announcement if you want to pass it around. But it has, the back part of it just has a lot of details about what your application is going to have to include. But one of the things you'll find with most program announcements like this is it'll tell you who's participating. So in this program announcement on methodology and measurement, we can see that several of the agencies that I've talked about, the National Cancer Institute, National Institute on Aging, NIAAA, NIDA, are all participating agencies. Then when you go on, one of the things that's usually very useful if you're starting to look for funding opportunities is just jump to, like on this, the second page, and jump to the executive summary. Say, what is it that they're funding? What is it about? What's the goal of this particular program? Again, a program announcement is going to target something. It's going to have, in this case, it's a fairly broad target, but it's looking for particular types of research. And basically here it says the goal is to encourage research to improve the quality and scientific power of data collected in the behavioral and social sciences. But then it goes on usually, and what they'll do is they'll give you an executive summary. Then you go on, and you get to part 2 of these announcements, and it's going to take you into the detail of the examples. And then it talks about, well, we're going to really encourage applications that have this. And they'll go in and then you have these bulleted lists that really start saying, we'd like to see something around this, we'd like to see something around this. And so if you look through those bulleted lists and see that, you know, that, oh, wait a minute, I've got some ideas about a methodology that would capture behaviors of healthcare providers in clinical settings. So that's the kind of thing you ought to be able, if you're responding to a program announcement, you ought to be able to look at this detail and identify very specifically a way that your project would link to one of the objectives that's identified. And if you can't, your odds of getting funded are pretty low. So I mean so I just wanted to give you a chance to, you know, look at this. There are tons of these online. There's all kinds of resources available for going online and finding out about grants. And I didn't put those up on the overheads today. But, you know, I think one of the things that what we're trying to do here is to give you just this I know this is a very, very quick, a very kind of global orientation to the process. And one of the things I wanted to do today is to give us plenty of time just to have some, you know, discussion or questions and answers as well, rather than spending all of our time on this. But before we go into that, and maybe help spur some of the discussion, I wanted to talk just a little bit about, I mentioned at the beginning that we're doing this series. And the whole idea is that my experience in I've served on probably over 20 grant panels in the last 7, 8, 10 years. Lose track after a while. I've reviewed grants from the National Cancer Institute, the National Institute of Mental Health, National Institute of Drug Abuse. For the last 3 or 4 years, I've been reviewing grants for the Center for Disease Control and Injury Prevention. So you get a lot of, I've seen a lot of different types of grants, and one of the things that I've become absolutely convinced, both from working with successful grant teams at one end, and then going and serving as a grant reviewer and seeing what is happening with grants, is that one, as I mentioned before, it's very competitive. The other thing is you get particularly newer investigators who have really good ideas, good science, but it's poorly packaged because you haven't been mentored in how to write grants. There are things that are very, very important in grants that will kill a grant that you might not think about, you know, as a new scientist. So, you know, for example, one of the big issues that shows up, just as one example, is in the methodology, research design methodology section of the grant, which is one of the more core parts of the grant, and probably should be at least 3/4 of your grant application to. That people will go into a lot of detail in certain aspects, but then skim over, you know, something that I've learned over the years is a fundamental question in getting a grant through a panel is power calculations. So you can sit there and say, I need to do this sample, and I'm going to get 500 people, and I'm going to test this, and then I'm going to test these interactions, and I've got this mediating hypothesis and this moderation hypothesis. And, you know, and I talked to Dr. Smith over statistics, and he told me if I had 500 people, I'd be fine. Now, people sometimes are not quite that good with it, but the point is that on a review team, there are going to be people who their role is to essentially say, okay, we're not going to spend $500,000 on this project if the effect size of what they're studying is so small that a sample of 500, especially when you cannot consider attrition, response rates, other kinds of problems that maybe they did or didn't consider, is not going to be sufficient to power the hypothesis tests that they're proposing. And so things like that all of a sudden become important in the grant. So you wouldn't have to worry about it with an analytic paper. You know, you go out and you draw a sample, you interview some people, you put some data together, and you write it up and say, hey, these findings were significant, these weren't. Typically, we're not writing about statistical power in our articles. We often don't even talk about effect sizes. We don't say, hey, you know, if I actually had a sample of 750, some of these things that aren't significant would have been. We don't usually go there. But when you're writing a grant, you're asking for a big piece of money to do this study, and one of the things, one critical feasibility question is your analysis powered properly? if you do everything the way you say you're gonna do it, are you actually gonna be able to test the hypothesis when you get done? So there's some very basic things like that you have to pay attention to in a grant that typically don't get paid attention to even when we're doing good science. Or they're kind of back in the back of our minds, but we're not really processing it the same way. And I've seen a lot of good grants, good ideas, and I've sat on panels, not get funded because they had good ideas, but they had poor execution around the ideas. They had a really sloppy power analysis where it really looks like they ran over and talked to somebody for 5 minutes and they threw together a table that doesn't have relevance to the hypothesis that they're testing. Or they'll go out and they'll say that my sample is sufficiently powered with an effect size of 0.23 to do this, but then they don't demonstrate in any place, in any way, that an effect size of 0.23 is reasonable for the kind of product, or the kind of analysis that they're looking at. But it's not just statistics. I mean, it's things like packaging the grant properly in terms of budget and personnel, and justifying your budget, and going and knowing what kinds of things you can put that you have to get into the body of the grant, that you have to explain, and the things that you can put into appendices. If you put really meaningful things into your appendices, you're in trouble, because only your primary, secondary, and tertiary reviewers are going to see your appendices. Everybody else on that panel won't have access to them, won't read them, won't want to read them. And people are very fussy about it. If it's not in the body of the text, then it's not really going to be considered. Now, so what you have to do are things like if you've got a particular scale that you're working with, and it's a well-established scale, you don't have to put all the questions into the body of the grant. But you should talk about the scale, you should talk about its resources, you should talk about any data we have about reliability and validity. And then you can say, in the full text of the scale is provided in the appendix, so and so. But the point is that the body of the grant has to stand on itself. And there are a lot of kinds of little things like that that are really different than the way we write articles. The way that we structure a grant is much more about, and that's one of the reasons we got into this with SSP, is that you've really got, on a standard grant, you're doing an R01, you're going to have a 25-page proposal. If you write a K award, it's a 25-page grant, or maybe it's 20. It's a fair number of pages. But a big part of any successful grant is not the basic idea. In fact, actually, your basic idea you have to learn to summarize in 1 page. Here's what I'm doing, here's why it's important, and here are the 4 specific things I'm going to do. Or the 5 specific things, or the 3 specific things. And that all goes on 1 page. And then you do a targeted literature review. You don't do a broad-based literature review. You do a background significance that's related to exactly what you're going to do and documenting it. And usually that's going to be 3 or 4 pages. And then if it's, depending on the type of grant, you usually have a section that talks about your prior work or your ability to do work. And then you go into section D, research methods and design, and that's the bulk of your grant. And so one of the things is that we can bring to the table in working with investigators is looking at what you're doing and saying, boy, this is really good, but you're not spelling this out. This is not going to get past a grant. We've got experienced grant reviewers here on campus that have sat on these panels, can look at things, can critique them, can tell you this is what you're missing. Now, we can't tell you that a grant is going to get funded. We can't tell you how a review panel is going to respond to certain things. And we often know going in, we've done grant teams enough, we know going in, we know where our weak spots are. We know where if somebody really wants to beat us up, they can. Every time we've submitted a homeless grant, we know that if somebody wants to be a real jerk about sampling, they can kick us out of the room because we can never defend the sampling design in a perfect world sense that some people would like to see. We just got a fairly major prevention intervention grant that we wanted funded. Rejected essentially because we can't satisfy experimental design requirements for a group of psychologists that run the review panel with the realities of trying to do experimental community-based intervention and prevention work in minority communities. And on the other hand, it's really funny because we get this grant turned down because we can't do a randomized control design in the community. And when I'm sitting on the review panel, like think I can say this because I'm not specifically talking about a grant or the nature of the grant, but grant got a very positive response from the community-based participatory research review panel, just because it right up front said, we're doing this research in a community that won't accept a traditional randomized design, and we're going to have to do it in another way. And so, you know, what's really a good idea in one review panel is going to be a bad idea in another. And that's part of where we can help you again too. We can look at and say, okay, is this a panel? You know, who's on this panel? We can work with you to say, okay, you're going to send it to this agency. It's going to go to a standing committee. Let's look up those standing committees. Let's see who's on it. Now they rotate, but they don't rotate 100%. They rotate like 20% on each year. So you can get a pretty good idea of kind of who you're going to be going to, who's going to be looking at your work if you know what panel you're going to. Or you can actually look at it and say, wait, I think this is the panel I want to go to. Talking to program officers, knowing, you know, because they can help a lot. You get a hold of program officers, send them an idea. This is what I want to do. This is what I'm thinking about. And the program officer will look at it and say, I think this would be the committee. And then they'll start telling you, okay, now to get it to this committee, let's pay attention to how you're titling your grant. Don't put this word in the grant. This word in your grant is going to go over to the epidemiology committee. Now you don't want it there. And so they actually help us that way. And so again, this is all new stuff when you're a new investigator. And this is the stuff that SSP and the people that we try to bring around the table know. And so what we think we can do is help accelerate the process of successful grants, enhance the possibility that the first time you submit will be a positive experience. And then if you don't get funded the first time around, we can try to help you do better the next time. The series, the next actual event that's scheduled in the series is one where we're going to help people get oriented. What else is around campus? We're not totally novel in what we're doing here. We think of ourselves as more value added. We're adding something that wasn't here before. The Office of
Proposal development?
Proposal Development. Thank you. I knew she would fill it. She would save me.
Hoping that's what you're going for.
Yeah. Does a lot of good work in terms of the layout of a proposal, of knowing all the new electronic forms, which I'm still trying to get my head around. I used to be on paper forms, and the last year and a half, 2 years, we transformed all of the grants now to the new electronic submissions. It's a little messier, it's a little more complicated, everything has to go in certain kinds of PDF files. They're really good at helping develop. They've got people over there that can help to some extent with the right kind of timing and planning, with the actual kind of editing of the grant in terms of making it flow better, those types of things. I think that's less of a concern than just the technical help with getting it into the PDF files, getting all the required forms, getting the required university signatures. They're very good at helping you work with the budgets. And we can help with budget narratives to justify things. So we can kind of get all of those elements spelled out so that they work well for you. So that meeting is actually going to be introducing other resources within campus, other people who are part of the team to help you get good grants out of the university. The March 14th is actually that standard workshop that the Office of Research Development has been putting on. Some of you may have already gone to it. It's Morrison and I'm forgetting the other fellow's name again, like I usually do. But it's a very good series. They come in and do a workshop where they basically talk about the structure of grants and how to write a grant. And I think one of the things that I've been writing grants for 15 years before I went to the workshop. There were a couple of new ideas that I really liked that they talked about, but more than anything, I remember saying in that session, you have it right, it's a good idea, it's a good suggestion. They talk a lot about how you need to write to the reviewer. And you need to understand what the reviewer's requirements are. The reviewers are going to be asked very specifically, and actually this holds pretty much for NSF or NIH. They're going to be looking at things like the innovativeness of your grant, the significance of your grant, and then specifically the nuts and bolts of it. Are you going to be able to carry it out? What's your approach? Is it viable? Are your human subjects protections handled properly? All those kinds of things. But anyway, but they also have good pointers, stylistic pointers. They have a really nice little booklet that they give you that kind of talks about, you know, here you write this section, here's how you write this section, here's how you write it to the reviewer's concerns, here's how you're succinct. And I think their pointers are very, very good and very well taken. And some of them are things that you kind of look at, oh, how important is this? You know, they're like, well, do your grant scenario 11. Well, there are grant requirements for how small a font can be, because people started getting, oh, 25 pages, 1-inch margins, but I can use really teeny fonts and get more words in. They've stopped that several years ago. You can't have more than 6 lines of text per inch, all these kinds of things. But you still read grants where people really push the limits, and you know, it takes a long time to review a grant. And for every time I'm on a grant review panel, I'll get like the one I was just on, I was assigned 6 grants to review. I was primary reviewer on 3, secondary on 2, and tertiary on 1. And the tertiary is the only time you really get off with writing one summary paragraph, otherwise you've got to write a fairly detailed response, and you rate these grants on all these things. You spend a lot of time with these grants. Your reviewers are not going to just glance at this. It's like taking, if you've gotten to a place in your careers where you're reviewing journal articles, take that about times 10. You're going to spend, I usually try to allocate about 8 hours per proposal in terms of my actual reading it, critiquing it, writing it up. And, you know, so you spend an awful lot of time. And part of it is that you have to understand the reviewers have their egos invested in this. You know, you're going into this panel with all of these other experts in this area, people who you respect, people who you maybe be in awe of, people who you have disdain for, you know, all of the above, but none of whom you want to look like an idiot in front of. You don't want to be the one who totally misses that they actually forgot to talk about human subjects in their grant, or that they didn't even do a power calculation. So reviewers are pretty exact. Now, it doesn't mean that they're trying to screw it up, but they pay a lot of attention to detail. And so the easier you make it for them to do their job. And that's a lot of the Morrison workshop. I think they do a great job of talking about layout, talking about strategies, talking about these kinds of issues. And how many of you have been to, you've gone to it, haven't you, Jacob? So some of you have been to it. If you haven't been to it, I'd recommend going to it. It's a nice component. Some of the orientation we've given you today about mechanisms and stuff feeds in, you know, a little bit. It helps a little bit more if you know a little bit about the layout before you go in, so you know that there's a specific aims, the background significance and stuff. But they do a nice job with that, and it's a free workshop. You just have to sign up for it. It's going to be over at the Nebraska Club. Is that right?
The Champions Club.
The Champions Club, you know, over by the football stadium. Maybe I should go again. I've never seen the Champions.
I know.
Then, May 12th and 13th, we're going to do it. It's a day and a half is what we're kind of looking at, isn't it? We're bringing in a social science researcher that I've worked with for a few years, who just recently put together a group of collaborators and wrote a book on writing grants for National Institute of Health. But the workshop is broadly based, it's not just over the National Institute of Health. He's actually bringing in about two or three other speakers as well. And we're going to put on a workshop that's going to be a little different than Morrison on it. It will have some of the same, I think, some of the same components about here's good strategies for laying out a grant. But this is a very good, strong consulting team that brings in expertise. One of the people that he'll be bringing here with him, the fellow who's leading the workshop, Larry Shire, is a psychologist who's had several grants funded. He works out in Las Vegas now. He's been a consultant with me on a couple of grants. I've sent some review panels with him. I've been very impressed with him. And he does an extremely good, very tough critique of grant proposals. But he's also bringing in Bill Bukowski, who is was the former division chief at NIDA. So we're going to get the perspective of somebody who's been setting in the federal agencies, looking at grants coming in, making decisions about grants and so on. We're not sure yet, but I think he may be bringing Carol Comfort. And Carol Comfort is, we'll talk about grants outside of NIH and more government kinds of grants like SAMHSA and other agencies. She was the head of SAMHSA for a time, so again, another person with a lot of experience at looking at grants, and particularly more of the applied kinds of grants. And so that's the type of people that are going to be coming and doing this workshop. I do know that part of what Larry likes to do are some group activities where we'll actually get people sitting down and trying to get to actually practicing a little bit of what we're talking about and then getting some feedback on it. I'm hopeful that it's a good session. I like the book a lot, and if nothing else, you get the book. We're providing it, so it's a no-cost workshop. It's right after the end of the semester. Then the continuing support structure is something that is still in evolution, definition. Part of it will depend on how much interest we generate. But basically, what we propose to do is get everybody through this first part, kind of get oriented, get thinking about it. And then we're hoping late in the semester, probably before Larry's workshop, that we'll be talking to some of you about a grant idea that you have, so a substantive interest that you have that you might want to pursue a grant on. And we can talk about, well, let's look at some mechanisms, let's think about it. We'll have you bring in your vetos and set and then I will chat with you, and if we need to bring in other people to have a conversation about, this looks like a good idea, it looks like you're in the right position, the timing would be good. Then what we would propose to do, and we're not sure how many folks we'll end up with, 3 to 6 or something like that, who have kind of got an idea that we think is they're positioned correctly in terms of where they're at here at UNL. If need be, we'll have a conversation with the department chair to make sure that they're supportive, that they're involved in this. But the idea would be then we'd like to actually set up work activities during the summer. And essentially, where we would be getting together kind of as writing teams and working with each other on and critiquing. One of the things you got to learn in this, it's like writing research articles. You got to put your stuff out in front of other people, and you got to listen to critiques. You got to understand it, even though you're convinced that you wrote it so that any idiot can understand it. That idiot across the table didn't get it, and maybe there's a reason that he didn't get it. So we try to work with you on that. And we would most likely target, a sequence of, following, like starting off with really articulating clearly the specific aims, probably taking that and then creating a short concept paper that we would then work with you. Okay, now let's go out and float this with the agencies. Let's get you an established contact with a program officer and the agencies that we're targeting, get their feedback early on, start working on pieces of the proposal, determining where you need help. Do we need to bring in a statistical consultant for some part of what you're doing? Do we need to bring in a sampling consultant? Do we need to bring in do we need to have do you really need, can you pull this off? Grants are typically not solo exercises, whether they're K awards or whether they're even an RO3. You put together teams. I learned this very early on when I started working with a very successful grant writer at Iowa State. But yeah, when he got ready to start writing his big grants, he was bringing in, collaborators from here and there. He was sitting there looking around the table at us and saying, okay, we got this covered, we got this covered, we got this covered. We don't have that, and we need that to get this grant funded. So he'd get on the phone, and he'd find, in one case it was Ron Kessler at the University of Michigan, who brought Ron in as a co-investigator, for whatever it costs us to do that. That was what we needed to do to make our grant viable. And that's part of what we look at. We set aside $2,500 per person in this workshop to support this kind of activity. So do we need to put you on a plane to fly out and talk to the people at the agency in DC? Do we need to get you together either by bringing them here or sending you someplace to meet with a potential collaborator to see whether they would serve as a consultant on your grant? We can wait until we get to the first book, we get the first draft of the proposal done, having it in pretty good shape. And then we say, okay, who are the 2 experts in this area? And we'll send the proposal out to those 2 experts and ask them if they want to review it. And we'll get the review back, and then we'll look at the critiques and decide what needs to be done next. And so we've set aside some resources so that the idea would be that at summer workshops, we would work in a collaborative group context, develop the proposals, get them refined so that either in the fall or the latest by the beginning of the spring semester, we have a submission. And in some cases, like I say, it may be that you come in and meet with us and they say, you know, it'd really be good if you got these 2 papers done first, and we can do some things to help get those 2 papers out, and then we can kick you into the series next time. So I think that that's, you know, there are a lot of different paths here, and it isn't like everybody is on the same track or in the same place. But that's the big picture. Did I capture it, Andy? So with that, I'm going to stop. Well, actually, I'm not going to stop talking. Some people know me well enough to know that that's a false promise. Here are, actually, I'm going to let you sort it out. There are 3 pages, so you have to take 3. These are just some examples. I quickly went out. Do you guys know about CRISP? Okay. There's lots of stuff you need to learn. CRISP is this search engine that's out on the internet. And if you go in and you do a Google on CRISP, it'll show up. And it basically, I think there's 3 individual pages. I think the first 3 should be different. I'm not sure. I think there's only 3. But anyway, grab a few, pass them on. These are just some abstracts I pulled off of CRISP. One of the things that you want to do, I think, is to find out. You can find this out in many ways, but CRISP is a real quick way to find out what's being funded. And for example, here I tried to pull off some examples of abstracts for. I think I've got an abstract for a KL1. I think I've got an abstract for an RO3. At least those 2 types. But you can go out and find them, and you can do them. I didn't exactly know who all was going to be here today, so I didn't spend a lot of time doing them within a specific area. But you could go in and let's say, well, you know, my interest is in the effects of discrimination on schooling. Well, you can go in and do some searches on those keywords, and you can see what kind of research is being funded in this area. Or you could just go in and say, I'd like to look through some KO1s and see what kinds of, you know, again, you're just going to see, in this case, you're just going to see the abstracts, but you at least go out and get an idea, well, what are people funding? And, you know, it begins to give you ideas of where you might want to look at. I'm curious, how many of you actually have seen a proposal, all packaged and ready to go out to the grant agency? I have some sense of what it looks like. So a couple of you, okay. So, you know, I think that's one of the things that we'll probably, you know, we haven't put together a little packet. Like, there's a couple of, who is it? There's one of the agencies, it's not one that we would normally go to. It has a really nice website that actually shows a mock proposal. There is, and actually it's listed in our archive presentation. I should have posted it on. I can send it out to everybody. There's a really neat little video site where they do a mock review. And if you not sure what a review session looks like, a grant review session looks like, it's a little bit play acting, but it gets you the general idea. Because these are really, like I say, part of it is you have to understand where the people that are reading the work are coming from. And they're being brought in as the experts in these areas. You are writing up your critiques, and you're going into this meeting, and the first thing you do is you get into this whole process of triaging, and you basically decide that the grants in the bottom half, we're not even going to take time to talk about it at the meeting. But then when you get into the grants, you're going to have about 15 minutes of discussion with the grant. The first primary person is supposed to summarize their major comments